June 12, 1944. The English Channel shimmered under a pale dawn, its surface rippling with the slow pulse of the tide. Offshore, just beyond the beaches of Normandy, Allied convoys moved like clockwork, endless lines of ships, barges, and landing craft hauling men, tanks, and ammunition toward France. But far from the noise of invasion, along the southern coast of England, something extraordinary was happening. Something so secret, so utterly unbelievable, that even German intelligence would dismiss reports of it as fantasy. At the small port of Dungeness, a handful of engineers, sailors, and scientists stood silently in the early light. They weren't soldiers, at least not in the traditional sense. Many wore civilian overalls, oil-stained and heavy with salt. Among them was a stocky man with a pipe clenched in his teeth. Brigadier Sir Donald Banks, the mastermind behind a project that most of the world would never know existed. He glanced at his wristwatch. 4:27. "All right, lads," he muttered, lowering the pipe. "Let's begin." The command passed down the line. Cranes groaned. Steel drums, massive reels wound with thick, tar-black hose, began to turn. Slowly, carefully, the hose uncoiled and slid into the water, guided by winches and tugboats. To the untrained eye, it looked like nothing more than cable laying. But this wasn't a telegraph line or a communication wire. It was the start of Operation Pluto, the pipeline under the ocean. Within hours, hundreds of meters of flexible pipeline disappeared beneath the waves, snaking across the seabed toward the coast of France. Engineers watched their instruments, adjusting tension and feed rate as the line vanished into the deep. Above them, gulls screamed in the wind. If a German reconnaissance plane had passed overhead that morning, it would have seen nothing unusual. Just a small harbor, a few tugboats, some cranes. Within days, even that would vanish. The port, the equipment, even the warehouses would be dismantled, packed, or relocated under cover of night. To the Germans watching from across the Channel, it would seem as though the Allies had abandoned the site entirely. But beneath the water, a quiet revolution was taking place. The Allies were solving a problem that had plagued every invasion plan since the beginning of the war: how to keep an army supplied with fuel once it crossed the sea. An army doesn't run on courage alone. It runs on petrol, millions of gallons of it, for tanks, trucks, jeeps, and aircraft. In the weeks following D-Day, the Allied advance across France threatened to outpace its own supply lines. Every drop of fuel had to be shipped across the Channel in vulnerable tankers, each one a tempting target for German bombers and U-boats. So British engineers working in complete secrecy had devised a plan so daring it bordered on insanity. Lay an underwater pipeline, hundreds of miles long, from England to France, capable of pumping millions of gallons of fuel directly to the front lines. No ships, no tankers, no targets. That morning at Dungeness, as the first section of pipeline vanished into the grey waters, Brigadier Banks exhaled a plume of smoke and said quietly, "If this works, gentlemen, the Germans won't know what hit them." And for weeks, they didn't. Across the Channel, at German naval headquarters in Paris, analysts reviewed aerial photographs and supply reports. Something was wrong. Despite the destruction of French ports and the heavy Allied losses during the landings, fuel seemed to flow effortlessly to the enemy front. Their tanks weren't running dry. Their trucks weren't stalling. Allied fuel depots in Normandy were full, yet no tankers had been spotted delivering it. "How is this possible?" one intelligence officer muttered, slamming a folder shut. "Fuel cannot simply appear out of thin air." In a sense, it didn't appear. It flowed. Quietly, steadily, through steel arteries hidden beneath the sea. Back in England, the engineers faced their own silent battle. Each length of pipe had to withstand the crushing pressure of the Channel, the corrosion of salt water, and the constant stress of pumping liquid fuel over impossible distances. Failures were frequent. Entire reels would split under pressure, spraying fuel like fountains before vanishing beneath the waves. But failure only fueled their determination. They worked by floodlight and blackout curtain, testing, recalibrating, and laying new sections. By July, the first line reached Cherbourg, a fragile, trembling connection that delivered its first drops of fuel to the liberated French coast. Soldiers filled jerry cans directly from the outlet. It wasn't much, but it worked. Within weeks, new lines were laid, some from the Isle of Wight to Cherbourg, others from Dungeness to Boulogne. The operation expanded at a pace that defied logic, and secrecy remained absolute. By late summer, thousands of Allied vehicles rolled across France, fueled by an invisible lifeline under the sea. And when Japanese observers in Berlin received reports of it months later, their reaction was one of utter disbelief. "They built what under the ocean?" one officer scoffed during a strategy briefing. "Impossible. It cannot be done." But it had been done. And the Axis, for all its vaunted engineering prowess, had never imagined it could be. As autumn approached, the engineers who had toiled in secret watched the numbers climb. Millions of gallons delivered, hundreds of miles of pipe laid, entire ports built and dismantled in silence. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, Dungeness fell quiet again. The cranes stopped, the tugboats departed. The reels of pipe were gone. To anyone passing through, it was as if the entire operation had never existed at all. An entire port vanished overnight. But beneath the gray waters of the Channel, Pluto still pulsed, unseen and unstoppable, fueling the liberation of Europe. August 1944. Deep beneath the English Channel, a steady vibration pulsed through the darkness, faint, rhythmic, and almost alive. Along the seabed, steel and lead-coated hoses stretched like arteries from England to France, carrying fuel that kept the Allied war machine alive. Above the waves, the Battle of Normandy raged toward its final phase. Tanks thundered through bocage country, trucks roared along dusty roads, and Allied aircraft dominated the skies. Yet few of the men who fought across France knew that every drop of fuel in their engines came through a secret lifeline, one so hidden that even many Allied officers were unaware of its existence. At an operations hut in a quiet corner of London, a small group of officers monitored pressure gauges, flow rates, and pump speeds. On one wall hung a large map of the Channel, covered in red lines and annotations. Pluto A, Pluto B, Hampshire Line, Dungeness Line. The air smelled of diesel and tobacco. "Pressure steady at 2500 psi, an engineer reported. "Flow rates increasing. We're at 90 barrels per minute." Brigadier Donald Banks nodded. "Good. That's another battalion of Shermans fueled before breakfast." He glanced toward a framed photo on the wall, a black and white shot of Winston Churchill inspecting a section of the pipeline. The Prime Minister had called Operation Pluto one of the most audacious engineering feats of the war. Churchill loved impossible ideas, and this one had nearly been too bold even for him. The plan had begun in 1942 under the direction of British engineer Geoffrey William Lloyd and the Petroleum Warfare Department. The problem was simple in theory, catastrophic in practice. How do you transport enough fuel across the Channel to feed an advancing army without relying on tankers? U-boats prowled the waters. Luftwaffe bombers hunted every vessel, and the Allies knew their fragile supply lines could crumble overnight. Then came the idea, piping the fuel underwater. It sounded absurd. No one had ever built a flexible pipeline long enough or strong enough to survive the Channel. But that didn't stop Britain's inventors. In secret factories across the country, engineers and industrialists began experimenting with designs. Two competing prototypes emerged. The first, codenamed Highs, was based on existing submarine telecommunication cables, layers of steel tape wrapped around a lead pipe, flexible enough to be coiled and laid by cable ships. The second, Hamel, was far thicker and more rigid, made of welded steel sections joined together and spooled on massive floating drums called conundrums, enormous reels that looked like something out of a Jules Verne novel. These monstrous contraptions, built in shipyards along the Thames and in Scotland, were towed by tugs across the Channel, unspooling pipe as they went. Each conundrum was 30 feet in diameter, weighed 250 tons, and could hold nearly 70 miles of pipe. Crews nicknamed them the Monsters of Pluto. The first tests were disastrous. Pipes split, joints leaked, and entire reels sank. but the failures only strengthened the resolve of the engineers. "If the channel can be crossed by men," one technician said, "it can be crossed by fuel." By late 1943, the HAI's pipeline finally passed its sea trials. In February 1944, under the utmost secrecy, work began to prepare the launching sites, tiny fishing ports converted into industrial zones overnight. Dungeness, Sandown, and Shanklin became hives of activity, disguised as harmless coastal facilities. Local residents were told nothing. Signs warned of experimental electrical work. Guards patrolled the perimeter. The men working there slept in barracks under code names, forbidden from discussing their jobs even with family. They labored through blackout nights, welding, testing, and assembling lengths of pipe that stretched for miles. Every drum was measured, pressure tested, and then sealed for transport. As D-Day approached, the final lines were staged in secrecy behind barbed wire. Then, after the beaches of Normandy were secured, the order came: commence Operation Pluto. At first, only a trickle of fuel flowed, then more. Within weeks, hundreds of thousands of gallons poured into Allied tanks and trucks each day. By late August, Pluto supplied nearly 1 million gallons of fuel daily, enough to power the relentless Allied advance across France and into Belgium. And all the while, the Axis had no idea it existed. In Berlin, German engineers pored over captured documents and intelligence intercepts. Reports from U-boat commanders confirmed that Allied fuel tankers were scarce in the channel. A few were sunk, but it made no difference. Allied mobility remained undiminished. "They must have discovered new refineries in France," one analyst suggested. "No," replied another, tapping a dossier marked Top Secret. "Something else is happening, something we cannot see." Meanwhile, in Tokyo, Japanese observers attached to the German High Command listened with skepticism. One colonel reportedly laughed aloud. "A pipe under the ocean? That is the stuff of fairy tales." He didn't know it yet, but those fairy tales were helping drive Allied tanks that would one day crush his empire ex-European allies. By September, Operation Pluto was no longer an experiment. It was an artery feeding an army. Over 20,000 personnel had worked in total secrecy to make it happen. Hundreds of miles of pipe now lay across the seabed, connecting refineries in Britain to forward depots in France. And as autumn storms rolled in, the pipelines held. Despite waves, currents, and even naval mines, the flow of fuel continued, steady, unseen, unstoppable. The Germans couldn't bomb it. They couldn't intercept it. They couldn't even find it. Operation Pluto had turned the English Channel into the Allies' most valuable secret weapon. October 1944. In the grey dawn over Boulogne, the ruins of the once bustling port still smoldered. German artillery had pounded the harbour for months before retreating, leaving behind a wasteland of twisted cranes and sunken ships. Yet amid the wreckage, British engineers were already at work. They weren't building docks or bridges. They were connecting something far more precious. A small steel valve protruding from the seabed. A corporal turned the handle. A hiss filled the air, followed by the gurgle of liquid flowing beneath the surface. The engineers cheered. The new Pluto line, codenamed Bambi, was alive. From the far side of the channel, a steady pulse of fuel surged through the Hayes and Hamel pipelines, traveling nearly 100 miles undersea to reach this desolate French shore. Each gallon that reached Boulogne represented another Sherman tank that could advance, another P-47 that could take off, another convoy that could move deeper into enemy territory. What had begun as a wild idea had become one of the most extraordinary engineering triumphs of the Second World War. In London, Brigadier Donald Banks received the first reports, his office filled with the smell of pipe smoke as he read the dispatch. Flow stable, pressure nominal. Daily output, 1,000 gallons. He allowed himself a rare smile. "This," he said quietly, "is how we win." Outside the window, London was still bearing its scars. Bombed-out blocks, boarded windows, and the ghostly outlines of destroyed buildings. Yet hidden beneath the chaos, was a secret network of pumping stations, compressors, and control rooms, an invisible infrastructure keeping the Allied advance alive. The central pumping station at Dungeness looked outwardly like a harmless power plant. Inside, it was a marvel of wartime engineering. Rows of diesel engines roared, driving pumps capable of maintaining immense pressure to push fuel across the seabed. Every section of pipe was monitored constantly for leaks. Pressure gauges lined the walls like instruments in a submarine. Crews worked in rotating shifts, sleeping in cramped bunks beside the machinery. Every man knew the importance of what they were guarding. A single rupture, a single malfunction, could cripple the entire flow of fuel. Technicians became obsessive about maintenance. They could recognize changes in pitch by ear, a subtle vibration that might signal a leak somewhere far out in the channel. Engineers joked that they could hear the heartbeat of Pluto, and in a way, they could. On the continent, Allied fuel depots sprang up in newly liberated towns, Cherbourg, Boulogne, and later Antwerp. Giant bladders and reservoirs were filled from the pipelines, then pumped into trucks and jerry cans. The fuel flowed day and night, feeding an army that was moving faster than anyone thought possible. Eisenhower himself would later remark that, without Pluto and the flow of petrol it provided, our armies might have come to a standstill. In war, logistics win battles, and logistics ran on fuel. Every tank that roared into Paris, every jeep that crossed the Rhine, every bomber that lifted from a French airstrip, they all depended on a silent network that stretched beneath the waves. But the miracle hadn't come without sacrifice. The men and women behind Operation Pluto worked under immense pressure, both literal and psychological. The secrecy was suffocating. Even their families had no idea what they were doing. In the industrial town of Tilbury, where the conundrum reels were manufactured, one worker recalled years later, "We built these enormous drums, and we weren't told why. Just that they had to be perfect. Not one leak, not one weld out of line. We guessed it was for something to do with cables. We never imagined it would change the course of the war." When the project was finally declassified years later, the public learned the staggering scope of it. Over 500 miles of pipeline laid beneath the channel. More than 175 million gallons of fuel delivered to the Allied armies. A combined engineering force of over 20,000 personnel, scientists, soldiers, and civilians alike. And through it all, not one pipeline was discovered or destroyed by the enemy. In late 1944, as Allied forces crossed into Belgium and the Netherlands, the Pluto network expanded inland. Mobile pumping stations followed the advance, feeding new branches that stretched toward the front. At one such outpost near Lille, an American logistics officer stared in disbelief at the flow meter. "You're telling me," he said, "this stuff's coming from England?" A British sergeant grinned. "Right under Jerry's nose, sir." Meanwhile, in Berlin, the mood had turned grim. Reports from the front described an Allied army that seemed unstoppable. German analysts struggled to explain how the enemy maintained such momentum, despite constant air attacks and the destruction of major ports. When one intelligence officer suggested that the Allies were somehow transporting fuel via underwater conduits, the room erupted in laughter. "Pipes across the channel? Don't be ridiculous," a colonel scoffed. "Even if they could build such a thing, our U-boats would have destroyed it instantly." But the U-boats never saw it. The pipelines were too small, too deep, too perfectly concealed against the seabed to be detected. Operation Pluto remained one of the few Allied secrets that survived the war completely intact. By the winter of 1944–45, as the Allies pushed toward Germany, the flow of fuel through Pluto reached its peak, over 3 million gallons per day. The lines throbbed with energy like veins in a living creature, carrying the lifeblood of victory beneath the stormy waters of the Channel. The engineers who had once stood on the docks of Dungeness could only marvel at what they had built. What began as a desperate experiment had become a triumph of human ingenuity, a weapon of silence and endurance that turned steel, oil, and seawater into victory. And when the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the pipelines kept running, quietly, faithfully, until the last Allied convoy reached its destination. Only then were the pumps shut down, the valves closed, the heartbeat of Pluto faded. The engineers stepped back from their consoles, exhausted and proud. The war was over. Their secret war beneath the waves had been won. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe. Across Britain, church bells rang for the first time in 6 years. Crowds flooded Trafalgar Square, waving flags, singing and embracing strangers. The war that had consumed a continent was finally over. Yet in a quiet coastal compound at Dungeness, a handful of men stood silently before the great diesel pumps that had never ceased turning. Their faces were lined, their uniforms oil-stained, and their eyes reflected a fatigue that went deeper than sleep. Brigadier Sir Donald Banks entered the control room for the final time. He walked slowly past the humming machinery, laid a hand on one of the gauges, and nodded to his engineers. "Shut her down." One by one, the switches were flipped. The roar of the engines faded, replaced by the soft hiss of depressurizing valves. For the first time in nearly a year, silence filled the room. The heartbeat of Pluto was gone. Banks watched as the final dial settled to 0. "She served us well," he murmured. Outside, the wind carried the sound of waves breaking against the shore, waves that months earlier had hidden the greatest logistical secret of the war. Beneath them, the pipes still rested on the seabed, coiled like sleeping serpents across the channel floor. Their work was done. When news of Operation Pluto was finally declassified years later, the public could scarcely believe it. Newspapers ran headlines like "The Pipeline That Won the War" and "England's Secret Undersea Lifeline." For many, it seemed like something out of science fiction. But for those who had built it, it was simply a matter of necessity, born from desperation, executed through brilliance, and guarded by secrecy. The statistics alone were staggering. Over 800 miles of pipeline manufactured, 175 million gallons of fuel delivered from Britain to mainland Europe. At its peak, over 3 million gallons per day pumped beneath the sea. And a total effort involving over 40 companies and 20,000 men and women. Every mile of pipe was handmade, welded, coiled, and tested in total secrecy. Every pump was designed from scratch. Every valve was a piece of bespoke engineering, and yet not a single component was discovered by the enemy. To the Germans, it remained a phantom. To the Japanese observers, a myth. But to the Allies, it was the invisible port that fueled liberation. Even after the war, the ingenuity of Pluto echoed across decades of engineering. The techniques used to lay undersea pipelines would later become the foundation for peacetime oil and gas industries. Offshore rigs, fiber optic cables, and transoceanic pipelines all traced their lineage back to the secret work done on the English coast in 1944. Many of the wartime engineers went on to lead major post-war industries. Geoffrey Lloyd, the man who first proposed the concept, became Minister of Fuel and Power. The conundrum reels inspired future deep-sea cable technology, and the Hayes cable design, once dismissed as impossible, became a blueprint for modern undersea communications. But for most, their contributions remained unsung. There were no medals for the men who welded pipes through sleepless nights, or for the women who tested joints in hidden factories, or for the sailors who guided those impossible steel hoses across the cold Black Channel. They fought a war of silence, and they won. Years later, an aging Donald Banks returned to Dungeness. The site was overgrown, the buildings weathered by salt and time. The old pump house still stood, its concrete walls scarred, but unbroken. He walked to the edge of the beach, where the tide whispered against the shingle, and stared out toward France. Somewhere beneath those waves lay the rusting remains of his greatest achievement. He took off his hat and smiled faintly. "They said it couldn't be done," he said softly, "but it was. And that's all that matters." Today, fragments of Operation Pluto remain scattered across the English and French coasts. Sections of pipeline displayed in museums, rusted reels resting in forgotten harbors. Few who see them realize the magnitude of what they represent. Each segment of pipe once carried the lifeblood of freedom. Each length of steel was a declaration that ingenuity could triumph over impossibility. And though the pipelines are long silent, their story endures in the annals of military history, in the textbooks of engineering, and in the quiet pride of those who knew the truth. That one of the greatest weapons of World War II never fired a shot, never flew a mission, never stormed a beach. It simply flowed, cold, steady, and unstoppable, beneath the sea. In the end, Japanese and German officers who studied Allied operations after the war would express genuine astonishment. The idea that the British had built a functioning fuel network underwater, while under constant bombardment, defied everything they believed about Allied capability. To them, ports vanished, tankers disappeared, and yet the enemy advanced as if powered by magic. It wasn't magic. It was Pluto, the silent, invisible artery that carried victory across the Channel, a testament to vision, courage, and the relentless human will to solve the impossible.